Terrifying is how the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has described the potential fully-fledged Israeli incursion into Rafah in southern Gaza, where some 1.5 million Palestinians are packed in against the Egyptian border. Volker Türk has further warned that the civilian casualty toll could be very high, with mostly women and children likely to be killed or injured. The UN has also expressed concern that the incursion into Rafah could also mean the end of the meager humanitarian aid entering from Egypt, with implications for the hundreds of thousands facing famine and starvation to the enclave's north.
After a military operation in Rafah freed 2 Israeli hostages on Monday, at least 74 Palestinian deaths in the process, according to local health officials. And while Israel argues it's doing everything to minimize civilian deaths, the numbers speak for themselves.
A potential full-fledged military incursion into Rafah, where some 1.5 million Palestinians are packed against the Egyptian border with nowhere further to flee, is terrifying. An extremely high number of civilians, mostly women and children, will likely be killed or injured. We have warned against actions violating the laws of war. The prospect of such an operation into Rafah risks further atrocity crimes. The world must not allow this to happen. Those with influence must restrain rather than enable. There must be an immediate ceasefire. All remaining hostages must be released, and there must be renewed collective resolve to reach a political solution.
The Security Council met behind closed doors on the developing situation Monday, but members made no comments at its conclusion. An Algerian resolution demanding a humanitarian ceasefire stalled due to a lack of US support, and a new hostage ceasefire deal struggling to agree parameters with both sides.
I am particularly worried by reports that the Israeli military intends to focus NEFT on Rafah. Half of Gaza's population is now crammed into Rafah. They have nowhere to go. They have no homes and they have no hope. They are living in overcrowded makeshift shelters, in unsanitary conditions, without running water, electricity, and adequate food supplies. And all of this underscores the need for full respect for international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and ensuring that essential needs are met.
Regional countries including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Jordan and Egypt have warned Israel of serious repercussions were the IDF to move on Rafah. While in Washington, the United States says it continues working towards a pause in fighting as the civilian toll becomes too hard to ignore.
What we said is we don't believe that it's advisable to go in a major way in Rafah without a proper, executable, effective, and credible plan for the safety of the more than 1 million Palestinians that are taking refuge in Rafah. They've left the north, and they certainly went south out of Khan Yunis to try to get out of the fighting. So Israel has an obligation to make sure that they can protect them.
And with much of the enclave destroyed, questions about where Palestinians can now move to after fleeing south to escape fighting in central and northern Gaza.
We don't want to see any forced relocation of people out of Gaza. That's home for the Palestinian people. Well, again, that's something that we have and will continue to discuss with counterparts in the region, but it's home to those folks. That's Gaza's home. And they shouldn't be forced to leave Gaza if they don't want to leave. Now, if there's going to be operations in Rafah or around Rafah, the Israelis have a commitment, an obligation to make sure that they can provide for the safety of innocent Palestinian people that are there.
Taking to social media, the prosecutor to the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, expressing his deep concern by the reported bombardment and potential ground incursion into Rafah, warning that those in breach of the law would be held accountable. Sherwin Ricebees, SABC News, New York.
For more on this, we're now joined by SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Peace, and he joins us from New York. Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Of course, I mean, we've seen those terrifying reports coming out from Rafah, and one would say that that was really the only safe space here for Palestinians who had fled from the north. What is the latest that you're also hearing from the United Nations when it comes to their reaction into what has taken place at the Rafah border?
Mbali, the decibel of the sounds you're hearing from various UN officials is very high. I mean, the High Commissioner for Human Rights in that package that we did earlier talks about the terrifying scenario that is facing the international community, no less the people that are sheltering, essentially, in the south of Gaza. Remember, this is a conflict, this is a war that started in the main in the north of Gaza. People were told to move to central Gaza. They were then told, we'll move, the IDF is coming to central Gaza to search for Hamas militants, to uncover various tunnels that they believe were in that area. So people were then told to move south, right? And so they've now moved south. They are crammed in, some 1.5 million, close to the Egyptian border. And so the argument goes that, well, since you've moved us from the rest of Gaza, there is essentially no place for these people to go were the Israeli military to force them to move again. The concern is that the infrastructure has been destroyed in the north. It has been largely destroyed in central Gaza. So there is a huge concern about what will happen to these 1.5 million people, more than half the population of the entire Gaza Strip, that is now crammed into the south at the behest of the IDF military. So where are these people are supposed to go? Concerns you're hearing from countries like Egypt that border that southern territory, warning Israel that were they to move forward with this incursion, that Israel will then suspend the decades-long peace treaty it has enjoyed with the state of Israel. So the ramifications about an expansion of this war remain very, very acute in Bali if were the IDF to move in on Rafah. We heard earlier from the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees, essentially the largest humanitarian organization that caters to Palestinian needs, particularly in Gaza. He spoke in Geneva earlier today. This is how he encapsulated what will happen if the IDF were to move on Rafah. Watch.
As you know, people are anxious and in fear of a possible large-scale military operation. If this military operation is taking place, the question is, where will the civilian go? There is absolutely no safe place in Rafah anymore, and the fear is that the number of people killed and injured might again significantly increase in a conflict where I reminded that already more than 100,000 people have been either killed, either injured, or are missing, which means in 4 months' time, 5% of the population, and we are still talking about the largest military offensive in the middle of a sea of displaced people. They are asked to move. The question is where to move. If you are in Rafah, you would see that from the border to Betlaya, which is 20 kilometers stretch, you only see plastic makeshift where hundreds of thousands of people are already living.
In Bali, we just received also a statement from the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. Essentially, he's also called the Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN, Martin Griffiths. This is part of that statement. Let me just read it a bit to you. The scenario we have long dreaded is unraveling at alarming speed. More than half of Gaza's population, well over 1 million people, are crammed into Rafah, staring death in the face. They have little to eat, hardly any medical care, nowhere to sleep, nowhere safe to go. The international community has been warning against the dangerous consequences of any ground invasion in Rafah. The government of Israel cannot continue to ignore those calls. And essentially, that is what you are seeing the South Africans pushing now at the International Court of Justice. They believe Israel is not in compliance with the provisional measures in Bali that were handed down by the International Court of Justice on January 26th. South Africa believes the court needs to act in that regard now.
Sherwin, when it comes to the position of South Africa, and we've seen the appeal there being done by the presidency, and it's being done really on an urgent basis, one would ask, how soon can we hear the interventions here being done by the ICJ?
Timelines are certainly difficult for us to predict, right? The court here has its own purview, its own perspective, its own timeline. So the court could pronounce on this at any time. I'll tell you why. Because Article 75, which the South Africans are referring to in its appeal to the court, says the following. This is Article 75, Mbali, of the rules of the ICJ. And it says the court may at any time decide to examine pro prio muto whether the circumstances of the case require the indication of provisional measures which ought to be taken or complied with by all the parties. So the provisional measures that they're referring to are not the ones that the court has pronounced itself on in the past, but South Africa is saying you would now have the ability to apply additional provisional measures on the basis of an argument that the South Africans are proffering that Israel is not in compliance with the original prescripts of the court. Pro prio muto is Latin for at its own initiative without a formal request. So the court could have reacted here without South Africa sending this letter. It has the ability, given that this is an ongoing case, to pronounce itself on whether Israel is in violation or in compliance with the provisional measures it handed down weeks ago. What you also know is that Israel is due to report back to the court a month since the provisional measures were issued on its compliance, on its implementation. Israel's going to argue that it continues to act within its right to self-defense. It will continue to argue that Hamas is using human shields. But what does international law say about, going through a human shield, for example? These are the legal questions that the court is going to be grappling with, and certainly South Africa not taking its foot off the accelerator pedal here, believing that the court now has jurisdiction to act against Israel based on what it believes to be non-compliance in terms of those provisional measures of Bali.
Sherwin, thank you so much for that update. That is our correspondent there, all the way from New York, Sherwin Bryce-Peace, just giving us an update when it comes to that incursion in Rafah.